was younger, my parents would often go out for dates at the weekend and leave me in the care of my older sister. She was 10 years my senior, and so her favourite activities included tricking me into doing embarrassing things or scarring me for life. One day she decided to do the latter by showing me the mini-series based on Stephen King's It. It's experiences like these that make me such a hardened horror fan in my adult life, but that made me afraid to go into the public shower at the pool for most of my formative years. It was only when I was a teenager myself that I decided to return to this miniseries that so scared me as a child and discovered that it was like this campy mess that wasn't scary so much as hilarious. So this prompted me to read the book, and as a result I discovered this small thing. Stephen King's It focuses on the story of 6 people brought together as children to face the horror that lives beneath their town, regrouped as adults to defeat it once and for all. The group are a bunch of misfit kids who get bullied at school and don't really fit into the norms of society, and it is a shame that the miniseries was so hilarious to me, considering that the book scared the shit out of me. You can imagine my excitement when they announced that they were making a remake in the form of 2 films directed by Andy Muschietti. I went and saw the first film, so-called Chapter 1, and I was not unsatisfied, to be honest, and I was really looking forward to the second one, and then when the second one came out, I was upset. I was not satisfied with it, Chapter 2. And I'm finally ready to talk about it, because I just reread the book. So the central question that I've set out to ask myself today is, what was my central problem with the second film? Why did it not deliver where the first film did? Am I mad from an adaptation standpoint? I don't think so. What went wrong here? It would be easy to list off a couple of things that I didn't like about the film and then go, oh, it was a pile of shit. But I'd rather give you a numbered list. Part 1, Not My Losers. It Chapter 1 focuses solely on the lives of the losers when they are children. Similarly to the book, it opens with the death of Bill Denborough's younger brother, George. Bill and all the other kids in the town have experiences with this weird monster that appears in many forms. He and the gang of losers are brought together because they're the ones who the bullies at school pick on the most, and they all just kind of run into each other. It's kind of a fate kind of deal. And the thing that this monster appears as is usually what this kid happens to fear the most. So they all come to this conclusion that this is the thing that got Bill's brother. Now, we know that Bill's brother is dead, but Bill thinks that his brother is missing, and so as a result they all go looking for this thing in the sewers, and they have this big old fight with it, and they think they killed it. We obviously found out in the second movie that this wasn't the case, but this is the film that we're working with for now. I actually have no problems with this first film, like I said before, and I actually really enjoy this first film as a standalone piece. The setups that happen in this movie have their payoffs in the second movie, and so we have to talk about it. In the book, each kid has a defining thing that makes them a loser. For example, Bill has a stutter. Ben is the fat kid. Beverly is poor, and she's also the only girl, which is kind of her thing as well. Eddie has asthma, and he's also got like this weird like hypochondria thing going on because of his mum, but we'll talk about that later. Mike is obviously African American, and Stan is Jewish, so there are things that kind of make them other to the other kids because it's stuff that the other kids don't understand, right? And then there's Richie, whose thing is kind of that he has glasses, also kind of that I don't want to say he has ADHD. I want to diagnose a fictional child, but he's the kind of kid who just can't keep his mouth shut. He loves a good chuck, does our rich. The thing about the book is that you get to explore the losers' home lives a lot more than you do in a film with a lot shorter runtime. And so they're also interesting and diverse characters. They're not just reduced to this one thing. Like, for example, Eddie has this thing with his mum, right? She's scared of everything, and so as a result she's kind of passed this fear onto her kid, and so anytime that he does something that's just natural for a kid to do, like climbing trees and stuff like that, she freaks out. So he's afraid of everything by extension. And you can see how Eddie is kind of this brave kid who is only affected by things when he thinks about like what his mother might think or what his mother might say when he gets home or whatever. And then there's Beverly, whose father's like really abusive, and her mother's there, but she kind of just ignores it. Then there's this whole complicated, diverse dynamic going on that actually the film takes out completely because Beth's mum's dead and she just lives with her father now, just to take out that little bit of you know, that little bit of nuance, that little bit of depth that was going on there. In the film, the kids really are just reduced to their one thing. Sometimes the thing has changed, and sometimes the thing has been stolen, and it's low-key problematic, not gonna lie. We'll start with Bill, who's the leader of the losers. He's the kid with the stutter, but he's also the bravest and the one that they all look up to, the one that they won't argue with, the one that they see as the older brother of the group, and that's obviously because he is an older brother. So he has that built-in feeling of responsibility towards his friends. The changes that were made to Bill's storyline are understandable, but strange. Like, for example, in the book, Bill knows that George is dead. He doesn't think that George is missing somewhere in the sewers. His brother was retrieved, he just didn't have an arm, which is unfortunate to say the least. I see why these changes are made. For example, it speeds the action because Bill feels like he's on a timeline, right? George is missing and he has to find him quick before something bad happens to him, so he's immediately looking for the thing/person that did this to his brother. And that allows us to get to the meat of the film quicker than the book does, with the kids just kind of happening upon information until they find out that, oh, there's this, like, clown haunting the town or whatever. I also don't know whether this change made the ending of this film more impactful in a way, because if Bill had known that Georgie was dead, shooting the image of Georgie that it puts up at the end wouldn't have had that much of an impact, because he would have known that Georgie was dead and it was just using the image of Georgie to mess with him. This way, he still kind of might believe in the back of his head that Georgie is alive and that he is actually going to shoot his little brother in the head, which is traumatic to say the least. Also though, with my critical thinking head on, I don't know whether this was a fake kind of tension, because after all, we did know that Georgie was dead. We saw him die at the beginning of the movie, right? So we knew that Bill wasn't going to be shooting his brother. And as well, it also just all was pretty cliched, right? I mean, we've all seen it a million times. It's a classic horror film thing. You have to face off against the image of your dead relative that you don't know whether they're really dead or not because they've been missing for years or something like that. And the whole arc of the story is that you've got to accept that that person has gone. And it's this whole acceptance thing in the stages of grief and whatever. Speaking of which, along the same lines, this allowed the adult portion of the remake, Chapter 2, to give adult Bill a more defined arc from child Bill. In this film, he has to accept that Georgie is dead, that Georgie has been killed, that he's not out there somewhere. And so that allows, in the second film, adult Bill to deal with the guilt of having sent his brother out into this storm. But I think that makes the whole thing a little less nuanced, because in the book, Bill knows that Georgie is dead, and so he works through that guilt and that grief when he's a child. His whole thing is that he's got this bike called Silver, and it's this metaphor for escape. He's using it to go faster than his grief and then the guilt and then the way that his parents treat him now that Georgie is dead, because obviously they're going through grief as well, and they kind of end up ignoring Bill in a way, and it makes him blame himself even more because he feels like they blame him in the way that any child would, because they don't understand complicated emotions like grief. This means that adult Bill in the book can then come to terms with how his parents treated him, and the fact that though it wasn't their fault, it still was wrong in the way that only an adult can look back and see things. Yeah, it might have been a little bit harder to translate into the film, but how much, really? Eddie for the most part was unchanged, and so we'll talk about him a little bit more in the adult section. Next we'll talk about Bev. Bev in the film was like really heavy-handed, and I'm not saying that Stephen King handled womanhood very delicately here, but he definitely handled it a lot more delicately than this film. And that's not to say that it wasn't appreciated, because in a film where there was such a short time to like build up character development, some things had to be heavy-handed so that we'd notice them. For example, Beverly's dad, there were like sexual undertones to the way that he would speak to her and stuff in the book, and when it was influencing him it would say sexual things, and we don't know whether that was for the shock value or because that's actually the way that her dad felt. But in the film, we get like one scene of him, and it's like really like oh my god, this guy's a fucking creep, because he just comes up to her and like sniffs the hair, and he's like, are you still my little girl, Bevy? And she's like, yeah, nah, and she goes and cuts all the hair off. That was a really heavy-handed metaphor as well that was not in the book, like the cutting the hair off to show that like she's not his little girl anymore, like fuck you, dad. It like that particular heavy-handedness was not appreciated from me. Just a little note. Also, before the scene where all the blood comes up out of the drain, she's like buying tampons in the shop when all the losers come in, and that just makes the whole, you know, puberty, period, menstruation, carry, metaphor reference even stronger, you know what I mean? Oh, one thing that I did like that was added to Beverly's storyline that I don't know was in the book, and I have read the book and I was trying to pay attention for this sort of thing, but as you can see it's very long, so I may have missed something. One thing that I did like about Beverly's storyline in the film that was added is she's in the bathroom at the beginning, and like the girl is like calling her a slut and stuff, and then like there's rumors that like Henry Bowers has like been with her as well, and he like perpetuates these rumors, and it adds this like layer of feminism to the story that wasn't there in the book. I actually can think, considering the themes that were going on in this book and that one of his main characters was a woman, there wasn't a lot of feminist rhetoric spouted here. Like there weren't a lot of feminist themes going on, and considering how long the book is, you think there would have been a lot more. I don't really know that they were addressed as heavily as some of the other issues in the book, and it's not that I'm complaining, and it's not that I think it should have been any longer. Don't worry, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying it's weird. Like, for example, Stephen King claims that he didn't intentionally put any homosexuality in this book, so if any of his characters aren't gay, why is homophobia a theme? But one of his characters is definitely a woman, and feminism isn't like a theme. Like misogyny is not a theme, apart from with her abusive husband, but we'll get onto him in a bit. And is that even necessarily a feminist issue? Abuse can happen to anyone, from anyone of any gender. So I don't know. Do I have beef with Stephen King? I don't know. The film added this layer of feminism by having these rumors about Beverly, because like she couldn't say anything to change anyone's opinion of her because of her class and like her reputation already at the school because of that. And it was such a small little thing to put in there that just added this extra layer of nuance, and like that's kind of the reason why I'm like, Stephen King, you missed out on an opportunity there, dude. Do better next time. Okay, we're going to get into the really annoying stuff now, to be honest, so buckle up. I'm going to talk about Ben next. Ben, for some reason, has inherited Mike's history thing. In the book, Ben is very clearly the architect, and that's what he grows up to be. He demonstrates this by building a dam, and then he builds them a clubhouse underground, and it's all very cool and fine. Mike is the history buff because his dad's the history buff, so he hears all these stories from his dad, and he's the one who eventually comes into the group and tells them that his dad thinks that there's this evil thing living under the town, and they all realise they've had encounters with this evil thing, and that's why they can go and hunt the evil thing. Hurrah, hurrah, we're on an adventure. So Ben takes Mike's history thing because he's the new kid in school, and so it kind of makes sense that he would be interested in the history of this new town that he's moved to, especially if he realises that there's something fucking weird about it. But can I just ask, who said Ben was the new kid? Like, I even read through this recently and didn't question that Ben was the new kid. I had to read this back. Stephen King doesn't say Ben's the new kid. The miniseries said Ben was the new kid. Are we listening to the miniseries now? Did you see the scene where Beverly threw those fucking things off the dressing table at Tom? It was terrible. Why are we listening to the miniseries now? Eddie's a virgin. So yeah, Ben didn't have to be the new kid. And so Mike could have had his history thing, but he made a whole other mess with Mike that we're going to get into in a minute. So anyway, we give Ben the history thing and we leave Mike with nothing. And so there's no hint of Ben being an architect, at least not that I can tell. That's why it feels like when they flash back in the second movie, back to them being kids, and they have the den building scene, it seems like they rammed that in there to kind of explain why Ben had ended up as an architect when there was like no mention of that before. And it also doesn't make sense why Mike is a librarian, because like who is Mike really in the film? Should we talk about Mike? Mike in the film has dead parents, which is like, why? At first, it was like, oh, they died in a fire, and I thought, oh, right, so they killed Mike's parents to make the Black Spot fire, which happens in the book, more relevant. His parents died in the Black Spot fire or something, right? No. His parents did not die in the Black Spot fire, they died in a completely unrelated fire. Why did you kill Mike's parents? Mike's relationship with his dad is one of my favourite things about the book. I think it's really sweet, and like he's got like one of the only nuclear families in the book that isn't completely dysfunctional. And it's weird that they decided to take it out because, like I said, it doesn't make sense with the whole history thing and Ben being an architect instead of the new kid. I don't know. So Mike literally got left as the guy holding the gun. Like that's his whole storyline. They set him up. He's in the paddock with his granddad, and his dad's like, you've got to shoot the sheep or the sheep's gonna shoot you. That's the way of the world, son. And obviously his parents are dead, and they were apparently like locked in a room, and they were trying to get to him, and he was like frozen in fear because he was dead young and like he didn't know what to do. And so he, I guess, feels responsible for his parents' death in a way. And all of this comes to a head at the end of the film when the rest of the losers have gone down the well, and Henry Bowers, the bully, turns up, and he is like fighting Mike, and he's gonna shoot Mike with the gun, and Mike ends up pushing Henry down the well, and I guess he shot the sheep before the sheep shot him. It's an attempt at an arc, I guess, which is better than some of the others got, but first of all, I just feel like it's in bad taste. You could take whatever you think I'm saying from that. But as well as that, the whole having Mike kill Henry thing, because spoiler alert, Henry isn't even dead. He comes back in the second movie to be fucking useless again. Having him kill Henry doesn't have as much impact if we don't hear about the history that goes on between Mike's dad and Henry's dad, and you know, the whole moral about how generational hate is passed down, because Henry's dad hated Mike's dad, now Henry hates Mike, and it's for literally no reason, and Mike is getting absolutely shit on, and Henry actually kills Mike's dog. And if we'd known in the film that Henry had killed Mike's dog, it wouldn't have mattered that the arc was shit, because the revenge just for the dog would have been enough. Definitely should have mentioned that he killed the dog. Next we're going to talk about Richie. I'm going to talk about Richie very briefly. Okay, so this monster, we'll call him Pennywise, right? Because his favourite appearance is that of a clown. We don't really know why. It's just his fucking thing, I don't know. And so Richie's whole deal is that, like, we find out he's scared of clowns. And so even, like, the most base form of this creature that the other kids are like, what the fuck, weird clown? He's like, terrifying clown. Why? Like, one of the kids' arcs is literally, I'm afraid of clowns, and we go and kill a clown at the end. Is that a satisfying arc for us to have? I understand that Richie has an arc in the second film, and we are gonna talk about that. Don't worry, Reddie fans, we're gonna talk about that, but I am not satisfied with the arc that Richie has in this film, considering that Richie is, and it's so hard to say this, like, it's so hard to say that you have a favourite loser, but if I were to have a favourite loser in the book, it would probably be Richie. He's such a good character in the book, and it's so obvious that he, like, uses humour to, like, deflect from his, like, insecurities about himself. Even though everybody puts him down all the time, he ends up fulfilling his dreams and doing what he loves and doing his voices. And I think it's really cute and sweet, and I feel like he got done dirty a little bit in the film. Richie was an amazing character in the film, and he is one of my favourite characters in the film. They do him justice in the respect to, like, his character and the way that he is. But in respect to the arc in this first film especially, when you actually think about it, it's a little unsatisfying. And I understand you do have a lot of characters and some of their stuff is going to get pushed to the back. But when you have such a big character as Richie, people are going to stop for a second and think, was his arc actually just that he's, like, killed a clown? Finally, we're going to talk about Stan. Stan had a really clear setup for his arc in that he was going to have a bar mitzvah, which was this really obvious puberty reference, because, like, bar mitzvah is literally, like, that's the ceremony of you becoming a man, right? But then, like, the bar mitzvah happens in a montage off screen, and, like, it's saved for the second movie. And so Stan, again, doesn't really have an arc in this one, and it feels like, especially when you watch the beginning of the second film, Stan was just there to be the one who dies, because he's really, really pushed to the background in the same kind of way that Mike is, possibly even more. These unfinished arcs leave us somewhat unsatisfied with this movie, but because the rest of it was so good, and it really helps like this childhood wonder that Stephen King wanted to portray in his book, I feel like it wasn't really that big of a deal. Eddie and Richie in the film definitely stole the show, and I don't know whether this was a fact of script or just the actors having the amazing chemistry that they did and the big personalities that they did, but it did kind of end up feeling like Bill was the secondary character in his own movie. And this definitely carried over into the second film as well. So as you can kind of see, this film took a very different direction from the horror that Stephen King was going for. It was more of an adventure, think like his other book, Stand By Me, where it's like these kids going on a journey to like discover the secrets of growing up and death and stuff, but with a lot more death. I feel like it really worked, and like I said before, it really captured the energy of the text, even though you could see that it was trying to make it more of a self-contained story than Stephen King originally intended with his 1,100 page break. So I was willing to roll with it. Honestly, like, I've never had a problem with adaptations, really. It's just that if you take an adaptation and you take away the spirit of it and the original message that it was trying to portray, have you really made an adaptation, or have you just made a fan fiction? Oh, was that a hot take? I don't know. Anyway, the essential message that I'm trying to get across to you here is these are not my losers, but they're close enough. But I feel like the second film took this, ran with it, and made these losers alien to me. I'm gonna get into that in a minute, but for now we're gonna get into part 2. Pennywise and Derry. Chapter 2 is really where we start to get into the more heavy adult themes that the book displays, and that's because obviously the losers are adults now and they're going to have more adult problems and more adult fears, and they're the things that are going to be explored during the course of the film, or you would hope so anyway. But before we get into the actual plot of the second film, I'd just like to take a moment to discuss the themes around it as a separate entity entirely. So in this second film, we are entreated to some of Pennywise's backstory. Through the drug trip scene, which we'll get to later, we find out that it is this alien creature fell to Earth via a comet around the time of the dinosaurs. We don't know whether Pennywise is the one who killed the dinosaurs in this universe. I don't know whether that's supposed to be implied, but it kind of is. But that's pretty much all we get. In the book, it's a little bit more complex than that, and I think that there was an attempt to portray this in the film, but it didn't come across very well, and that's why I thought we should take a step back here before we get into why the losers were such a mess in the second film. Just talk about themes and stuff, and, you know, shape-shifting monsters. Just take a little break. So while the backstory for Pennywise that the film portrays is accurate, there's a lot of context left out that makes everything a little bit less sci-fi and more like, is this Christian subtext? Essentially something that was left out of the film is like, there's this other creature that's just a big turtle that like sicked up the world. The turtle is our creator, and possibly there's a guy who created the turtle. Pennywise is this thing from another dimension that's like come into our dimension to feed off us, right? He's been here since before we were here, and he like took up in the place where Derry would grow. Unsure whether Derry was already kind of a cursed place and Pennywise chose it because of that, or whether the place is a whole mess because of Pennywise. Derry, the town, as a character, is one of my favourite parts of the book, and it's actually the part of the book that scares me the most. There is always this sense of like foreboding and like impending doom. Because the thing about having Pennywise live underneath your town is that everybody is a little bit more accepting of violence, a little bit more prone to violence. That makes it not very good to be a kid growing up there who isn't aware enough of said violence and, you know, is exactly the kind of prey that Pennywise is looking for. This atmosphere that Pennywise creates in the town is what allows Stephen King to explore these themes of racism, homophobia, anti-Semitism. because all of these things that are natural, well, were natural, I should say, parts of human society, but they were just more emphasised in Derry. The way that Mike's dad describes it is that the soil is right in Derry for bad seed. So the bad seeds of like racism and homophobia, they get sown in Derry and they can take root better than in other places. And that's because of Pennywise. I understand that it's hard to translate this overall feeling of foreboding about the town into a film, but horror films should have an overall sense of foreboding anyway. Considering that the horror elements were ramped up in this film, I feel like that was more of what they were going for, and so they failed in that respect. There was an attempt, however, to convey the attitudes in Derry through the film. There were small examples in It Chapter 1 when Ben is being attacked by Henry and his goons. Henry gets a knife out and Ben is like yelling at this car for help, and the people very clearly see that something nasty is going on, and yet they just drive by. Also, I think another scene that really portrayed this for me was when Eddie's arm gets broken. His mum comes to pick him up and she's like yelling at all the other kids, and Ben's stomach is like completely ripped open and like he very clearly needs to probably go to the hospital, and she just doesn't see it and doesn't care. It's really strange. There isn't a very good attempt to explain why these things occur, and I think that without the knowledge of the book behind you, these things would just seem really weird and out of place. It's actually Eddie who says it the best in the book. He says that the real monsters are grown-ups. He says this because he understands that the grown-ups are the ones who are letting this happen and not really making any real attempts to do anything. They want to blame the kids missing on them running away from home because they had a difficult home life, or they want to blame their stepdad because he's like a drunk or whatever. They don't want to accept that there's something bigger going on. They want everything to be tied up neatly so they can go on living their normal adult lives. And this carries over into the themes of the book, because when this book was set and when Stephen King was writing it, things like racism, homophobia, anti-Semitism, they were a lot more of a problem than they are today. And I'm not saying that it's not a problem today, but there were incidents happening that were a lot more akin to those in the book. People didn't agree with these things, right? But because they wanted to get on with their normal grown-up lives and not be bothered with these terrible things, they had the privilege of just being able to ignore it, right? And that's what the grown-ups are doing about these missing kids. They have the privilege of just being able to ignore it because Pennywise doesn't prey on kids. And that's where we get to the big theme in the book. The big metaphor of what Pennywise, like, actually is. Well, he's us, but he's also these societal norms that are wrong, but everybody just ignores them and lets them happen because it doesn't affect them. Pennywise only comes around once every 27, 28 years or something like that. And there's all people in the town who fully, like, suspect that there is something weird and supernatural going on, but because it happens so sparingly, and so most people will only have to experience it maybe twice in their life, they just let it happen. And even though they had more opportunities to show this in the second film, they just didn't. The film spent so much time focusing on like things that felt pointless in the end, and yet didn't spend time working on these themes that it had established in the first film. And that's why it was a flop. I think the one thing that I did appreciate about the second film was something that I mentioned earlier. They made the theme of homophobia and homosexuality more relevant to the losers, and therefore got to explore it more deeply by making Richie and Eddie have this whole romance thing, possible romance going on, slight hints to a romance, blink and you miss it, you have to squint a little bit, romance? No, I did like it. It was good, and there were, the hints were there. It wasn't like they just shoved it in at the end, and yes, it was problematic in its own little way, but it was appreciated that there was an attempt to make at least one of the themes more immediately relevant to the losers and what was going on with them. We will get more into the Reddie subplots later, and especially if you want to hear my thoughts about Reddie, just skip to the appendix. It was a real shame to me that Pennywise just got explained away as this alien sci-fi creature, and that was all we got. And it really took away from some of the themes that had been established in the first film, which isn't good for continuity. And speaking of which, part 3, continuity. Another little note before we get into It Chapter 2, and I promise that I am going to start talking about the film that this video is about at some point. Let me just tell you about this film's continuity, because somehow they went in their own direction with the first film and they set up their kind of own continuity for what was going on with the monster, because Stephen King does leave it somewhat ambiguous as to what this creature actually feeds on. The first film made it clear that he fed on fear, the fear of the children. I think the problem that they must have run into is that once you take out all of the fate stuff and all of the flashbacks that the losers have when they're adults, and all of the stuff about Pennywise's backstory and the ritual of church, if you take out all of that, you end up with essentially the same story twice. And even in the book, the adult loser's story is a lot less engaging, and you do find yourself wanting to get back to the kid's story. So they weren't left with a whole lot to work with once they made this a more self-contained story. Which is why I question why they didn't put in more stuff about Derry's past and about the attitudes in Derry, or about literally anything that I just mentioned. So basically the solution that they came up with was to just make shit up. In It Chapter 2, Mike, who has stayed in Derry after all of the other losers moved away, rings them all up and tells them that Pennywise is back and he's killing kids again. None of the losers remember their childhood in Derry, but they all come back on like the strength of this promise that they made when they were kids that they were going to come back and kill it. So they come back and they're all mates again and it's all very nice, and then something creepy happens with the fortune cookies and they find out that Stan killed himself. It's kind of glossed over a little bit in the film, and you kind of forget about him as well, because obviously we did not make any kind of connection with Stan in the first film, and that's why it felt so cheap that he was the one who was killed off, even though it happened in the book. It was actually like the first thing that happened in the book after George got killed at the beginning. So it was weird to kind of have a character die and then start to curse after that. But it made it really sad when you saw that character at the end standing in the pool making them all promise to come back, because you knew he wasn't going to come back. So it was weirdly done, but it was really effective. Anyway, find out that Stan is dead, and obviously this makes them all freak out and some of them want to go home, and eventually they agree to stay, and then Mike's like, okay, we're going to do this ritual, the ritual of church, right? You all have to go and get a totem from your childhood, and then we'll all go to the tunnels where we went to fight it last time, right? So they all go and find a totem and they all have a scary experience, kind of akin to the first book. Some of them are scary, some of them are hilarious. Not really relevant. Henry Bowers escapes from the mental asylum that he's been in. Obviously he killed his dad and stuff, so he wasn't going to get away with that lightly. Yeah, he breaks out, and instead of attacking Mike and leaving Mike out of the big final battle, he comes straight to the hotel and attacks Eddie, and Eddie ends up killing him. So everybody's good, and we all make our way into the sewers. It's like half the film is like this final battle where it's like there's a little bit of the funhouse scene that we had from the first movie like repeated, and it's like call back to that, and it's kind of entertaining. And then it goes on for a little bit longer and it's really dragging. Oh yeah, the ritual didn't work, so they have to like make stuff up. So eventually they come to the conclusion that they can just like shout at Pennywise until he becomes a small boy, and then one of them just, it must be Bill, right? I can't even remember right now. One of them just reaches inside of his little like plasticine chest and just takes out his heart. Like the essential, like the idea, he feeds off their fear and he becomes what they think of him, right? So if they're not scared of him and they think of him as this small defeatable thing, he can be defeated, right? Logic. Kid logic. It doesn't come across very well. The scene where they're all shouting at Pennywise and like just repeatedly shouting, you're a clown, you're a clown. There's no conviction whatsoever in some of their voices, and it's just really, it was a really laughable scene. We're going to get into why that's a problem in a little bit, but I just wanted to give you a rundown of the plot right there, because the thing that they end up doing with this is, in the book, Instead of telling them, oh, you have to all go and find a totem of your childhood, Mike says, just go and wander around a little bit, see what happens. And they do. They all have a scary experience, and then they join back together and go back to the hotel, and it happens kind of the same, apart from the thing with Mike breaking his leg. What they did by adding in the finding the totems was add more direction to this part of the film, but it culminated in the same thing, and it actually subverted the message that Stephen King was trying to portray in this bit, which was they had to get back in touch with their instincts the way that they would when they were kids. You know, just wander around, do whatever comes to you. I don't go out anymore without a purpose. Like, even when I go, like, for my mushroom walks and stuff, I'm going out to find mushrooms, even if I'm wandering around in the woods in a random direction. You never just go out and wander around anymore and see who's about and what's happening like you did when you were a kid, and that's the spirit that Mike wants them to get back in touch with. And I think that by giving them a goal in this, they just took us even further away from the original intent, but also from it making sense in the way that it did when Stephen King explained it. So does it really add a direction to this part of the film? I don't know. Let's carry on. The film's tonally confusing. In the book, there are moments where something scary happens or something sad happens, and then the losers are laughing again immediately after. But it's their, like, camaraderie and the way that their relationship has always worked that, like, you kind of don't notice it as much. And plus, when you're reading a book, there's a lot of stuff in between the lines, so it feels like more time has passed, so maybe Stephen King cheated in a way. But anyway, this happens in the film, and it's like, dude, one of you just died, and now everybody's laughing. I don't get it. It did try and, like, cash in on the recapturing of childhood wonder that Stephen King went for in his whole midlife crisis allegory of this second part of his book. Like, it just came out as really cheesy. Like, we actually did get a scene of James McAvoy on a bike with, like, this swelling violin music in the background and, like, all the bright colours, and it was madness. I felt like I was back in the miniseries for a minute. And at the end of the day, they didn't really keep it as two separate films, did they? Because they did end up flashing back to the kids. I don't know that those flashbacks really served any purpose, apart from to capitalise on the obviously better relationships of the child actors. Like, make us emotionally related to the characters that were on screen. They didn't look like them, they didn't feel like them, and they just didn't have that natural, like, sense of friendship that the kid actors did. They just didn't have that chemistry, you know? You kind of had to have the flashbacks in there to remind us that we were supposed to care about these characters. I don't know. Also, something about the flashbacks, yeah? It flashes back to some things that we saw in the first film, and the cut isn't even the same. And it's just really weird, like, if you watch these films back to back, you notice it, because it's, like, really obvious. The flashbacks are really important in the adult bits in the book, because it's important to remember those bonds that they have, because if the losers aren't together, they're never gonna be it. Which finally brings us to Not My Losers, B. In It Chapter 2, Bill is not the confident and strong leader, the brave guy that all of the other losers think he is, nor is he the more in-depth version of this that Stephen King goes for. Bill's just a guy, and all of the others look to him as this brave and strong leader, like they did when they were kids, even though he's in the same boat as the rest of them, right? He doesn't remember anything either, but for some reason they all think he's the man with the plan. He is brave and strong for them. Bill's like the heart of the group, almost. He is like the place where they draw their strength from. This is portrayed somewhat in the first film. Like, Bill is definitely the leader of the group. He's the one who wants to go after Pennywise. He's got a plan to go into the sewers, etc., etc. But in It Chapter 2, Bill is a loose cannon. He's uncontrollable, man. He's off on one consistently. He comes back and everybody's looking to him to be the leader, and he does not have a single clue what is going on. Like, understandably, it could be the after effects of the drugs. And again, I say we will get into the drug trip scene in a moment. Bill like, he's so emotional, like, he gets randomly attached to this kid that they see in the town. Later on, he finds out that the kid's gone to the fair and like, oh my god, there's clowns at the fair, I have to go and rescue this child. Even though this wasn't in the book, it's very obvious that Pennywise is going to use this child to get to Bill. And of course he does. And the kid dies because of this, so good job, Bill Denborough, good job. And he's just like that through the entire thing. He just abandons the losers at the drop of a hat. Like everybody's got to be like, Bill, you're the guy, you know? Like, you got to be the guy for us. I understand that he's like dealing with the guilt of like causing his brother to die as he sees it, but it's just another way to waste time. It's just on this kid, yeah, that like we don't care about and who just dies like all the other kids. We saw him in the restaurant and like, oh, that means we're supposed to care about this kid a little bit more. It's like, they also set up the other kid who dies, the birthmark kid, at the fair with Adrian Mellon at the beginning, and it's like, what? So because we've literally just seen this character before in another scene, we're supposed to care about them? Kind of, you get a pass, kind of, because everyone's a child and everyone cares when a child dies, but it's a film, so you gotta make more of an effort than that if you're gonna make an effort at all, you know what I mean? We'll talk about Mike next, because once again, Mike is my biggest like source of beef with this film. Should we talk about Mike in the book a little bit? We shall. I don't like he's probably like one of my favourite characters, because obviously he went from this child who liked listening to other people's stories to this guy who went and did all this like underground research, and like he gets tip-offs from the police and stuff, and he's just a librarian, he's just a dude. Basically like uncovers all of these secrets about Derry. So he's just like, he made librarians cool again. Not that they were ever uncool. I've always thought librarians were cool, but he's like the mega librarian. He's the boss librarian that you have to fight after you've beaten all the other librarians, which you'll never do because librarians are sick. Anyway, what I'm trying to say is that Mike is actually the guy with the plan. He's the guy with all the information. He remembers everything from when they were kids, and he's kind of helping them along, jog the memories a little bit, but don't push him too hard because that would be traumatic. And that's why it's a really big blow to the losers when Henry Bobbers comes along and breaks Mike's leg in the book, and he can't be there for the final battle because not only does it bring their numbers down by 2 when you take out Stan as well, Mike is the only one who remembers properly how they defeated Pennywise last time. He's the one with the most awareness about what is going on, and without him, their resolve is really shaken. If you had taken the Mike from this film out of the final battle, it would have made literally no difference. I'm going to talk about why I think he's still in there, but first we're going to talk about his character as a whole throughout the film. True to the book, Mike has his history thing back. In the first film, Ben stole it from him, but now all of a sudden Mike's just interested in history again. He's been reading up on the history of Pennywise because he's the one who stayed in the town. We don't know why, because that doesn't make sense, but I've already been over all that, so we're not going to get into it again, even though it really annoys me. Even though he's given this history thing back and he is the guy with all the information, for some reason, instead of making him this kick-ass librarian, he's made into like this crazy guy. Like, even though watching this, even though I know that Mike is right and there is like a killer clown and there is a way to defeat him, and that way is the ritual of Chud. I know that because I've read the book. In the film, that is not canon. The ritual of Chud does nothing. But, you know, watching the film for the first time, I didn't know that. So even though I knew Mike was right, or I thought I knew Mike was right, I thought he was a crazy guy. The biggest example is, at last, the drug trip scene. He specifically takes Bill away on his own, gives him some form of hallucinogenic. I don't know if it's like a peyote cactus or what, like they do in the old Western movies, but essentially he drugs Bill, and that's how we get its backstory, because Bill sees it, and that implies that there is some specific drug out there that makes you see just this one vision of it coming to Earth, which is like a really specific thing for a drug to do, and not possible, I don't think. Then at the end of the film, you find out that he lies about the ritual being the thing that will kill it, because the ritual has been done once before and it didn't work, and Mike is labouring under the impression that they can kill it this time because he's the one who saw that belief was the thing that hurt Pennywise last time. He obviously thinks if he doesn't tell the losers that it didn't work and that this is a surefire thing, their belief will be enough. And now that I really think about it, why didn't it work? Because essentially the way that they eventually win works off the same principle, so I don't understand why the ritual didn't work, because they did all believe that it would work. Unless, of course, the implication was that Mike didn't really believe it would work. But then he's surprised when it doesn't work, and he insists that it should work because they all believe it will work. So that doesn't work. Anyway, Mike's a crazy man. And so, if you'd have taken him out of the final battle by having Henry break his leg, it probably would have been a blessing in disguise, because I think that the only reason he was in the final battle was just so we could all shit on Mike Hanlon one last time. Like, the entire character of Mike Hanlon. Nah, not impressed with it in these two films, to be honest. Really been let down there. Yet again, a series of unfortunate events is the only place where I can get my fix for kick-ass librarians. It leaves them all more together at the climax of the film, which is good because there's been so much arguing and so much, like, of them not being together and not feeling that bond and that friendship for the whole film, that if they'd have taken Mike out, his entire character would have been pointless, to be fair. So I appreciate that one last ditch effort to make us feel like their friendship was really as strong as it needed to be, but it really didn't work because obviously we all just turned around and shit on Mike again because of course he lied about the ritual, the crazy fuck. Okay, next we're going to talk about Ben, because in the film, and there's no other way to describe his friends, Ben is a simp. He, like, keeps the yearbook that Beverly signs when he's a kid, and he doesn't even remember who Beverly is, but he just has it in his wallet, and I don't know whether it's supposed to be implied, but it is implied that he doesn't have other relationships with women. So, has he really just been holding out for a girl that he doesn't even remember all his life, and am I supposed to find that romantic and not insanely strange and humbity? Yeah, that is really humbity, actually. Ooh, I don't like it. Anyway, I'm gonna be real with you right now. I do not remember if there was like a kiss scene between Beverly and Bill in the film, but it's possible that there was and I missed it because I was just completely bored out of my mind. But even if there wasn't, there was the scene where Beverly was like, yeah, I remember when Bill wrote me a poem and it was like the most sexual thing that ever happened to me. Basically right up until the end when they have that whole weird thing where she's locked in the bathroom stall and he's buried in the den. She's basically just really set on Bill, even though Bill fully has a wife. And she fully has a guy back at home, even if he is a dick. I don't know whether they say he is her husband in the film, but obviously I'm gonna think that. I read the book. So he needs to be explained. So yeah, Ben's a total simp, and he's just not as much of a simp in the book. He is when he's a kid, very much a simp when he's a kid, but aren't we all? He doesn't harbour this crush for Beverly because he doesn't remember Beverly. And obviously when they all come back, all of these childhood feelings come back and they all experience these old crushes coming back in full force and they don't know what to do about it, and it's a whole weird love triangle. That's not portrayed very well in the film. And the romance feels like completely unearned. It feels less earned than the romance between Richie and Eddie, and that is literally a blink and you'll miss it thing. I'm probably not going to talk about Beverly in this bit because she's irrelevant in this film, apart from that one scene that I mentioned in the bathroom stall. She doesn't really play much of a part. She was a good character in the first film. Not as big or as bad of a bitch as she is in the book, but she's there and she's doing stuff, you know. In the second film, she is there. Obviously the stars of the show once again are Reddie and Richie, I'm not gonna lie. I feel like these guys really encapsulated the spirit of the child actors. I could really believe that these two were those two grown up. And yes, they were very funny. And yes, the romance was appreciated. I don't know whether I'm saying that's what saved the film, because nothing saved the film. But that is like That is one of the things that I enjoyed about the film, let's put it that way. Throughout both films, Eddie was translated the best, but there was one change that was a little bit strange considering the romance between him and Rich that is implied here, and it's that he's not as blatantly queer-coded as he is in the book. And according to Stephen King, he's not queer-coded, but I'll get more into it in the appendix. But essentially, the language that is used when Ben is talking about Beverly, this simpish language that I mentioned earlier when they're kids, the exact same language is used when Eddie is talking about Bill. Although the other kids say that they love each other, and even in their internal monologues they talk about how they love each other, it's never in quite the same intense way that it is when these two characters are talking about these two other characters. And so it's strange that all of the attention is focused on Richie being the one who is secretly gay, and there's no kind of an indication whether Eddie is or not. I just thought it was interesting that that was the way that they decided to go. Maybe because it was the unexpected route, I don't know. Speaking of unexpected, now we get to part 5, the ending thing. So, in the book, the adult losers are set on keeping their promise from the beginning. They're gonna go and kill Pennywise. This means that they spend a lot less time arguing and a lot more time focusing on the task ahead. And it also means that we get to spend more time at the beginning developing some of their adult lives and also some of the Pennywise lore, which was nice. Film doesn't bother with this. They spend all the time arguing and going looking for totems that turn out to be useless for some reason. One question that I burningly want answered is like about the adult lives that they briefly set up in the beginning of it, chapter 2. Beverly's husband is like abusive, and they clearly establish that, like they don't change it, and you're just expecting me to believe that she runs out on this abusive guy and he makes no later appearance in the film. By having him be abusive, you set him up as an antagonist. Even Beverly's dad in the film, short as his appearance may be, comes back later as it, pretending to be her dad, like, to scare her. And this happens in the second film as well. We see no image of her husband, and her husband doesn't turn up like he does in the book to do its bidding. So where the fuck does he go? And what the fuck was the point in introducing these adult lives? What was the point in introducing Bill's wife if you just weren't going to reference back to them at the end in any way, or have them come back at any point? We even see Beverly and Ben together on a boat at the end, and it's like, Beverly, where is your husband? You can't do that, you need to have a divorce first. The whole thing about changing the ritual and then having the ritual be bullshit, does it really give direction to the middle part of the film? Did we really need to have the ritual be changed if it was going to turn out to be bullshit? No, we did not. And it culminates in the entire ending half of the film being a final battle that goes on for way, way too long. I suppose now is a good time to mention the giant spider. Okay, so yes, in the book, its final form is a giant spider. That's not actually what it is. It's more that it's the closest thing that our brains can think of to what it actually is. As a person who is deathly afraid of spiders, this works for me. A giant spider is the worst thing I can possibly think of, and so maybe I'm biased to this ending, but I think it's pretty good. The idea that we can't even comprehend its final form, it's that alien, is really interesting. Stephen King does play with that a little bit throughout the book. Like, sometimes if the guys aren't looking directly at it, it's kind of like not a distinct shape. I also like the feminist connotations of the spider that are in the book. Like, so we find out that the spider is female and that it has eggs. I don't know, it gives me chills every time when I read it in the book when they find out that it's female, because it's like, oh my god, it is capable of producing more of it, and that is the most terrifying thing ever. And it also makes me laugh a little bit because we have to hand it to Stephen King that he really is just terrified of women. He knows that men are terrified of womanhood and the power that it brings. Also, if we're going to go into it a layer deeper, it is a woman, yet all of the faces, bar one, that it uses in the book are male. That is obviously because children find men scary and women aren't as scary. The one female image that it does use is like the witch from Hansel and Gretel, and that is partly used in the way that it uses Pennywise to draw Beverly in and make her think, oh, it's just an old woman, a harmless old woman. Oh my god, the feminist connotations. So yeah, in the second half, Stephen King did, you know, I don't know whether it was intentional, but he did get into some feminist shit, you know, and I was definitely going to mention it, wasn't I? Even the most base form that it wants the kids to think that he is, Pennywise the dancing clown, is a man, because men are the people in this society who have the power. Pennywise wants to appear at the very least as an image of power. So Pennywise appears as male even though it is female. In the film, in It Chapter 2, we are treated to a lot of talk about the endings of Bill's books being bad, and this is like a reference to the ending of this book apparently being bad. The giant spider is not popular apparently. It really was implied that this film was going to do something really different with the ending and something that was going to really blow our minds, right? And we got just a giant spider with a clown head. It was just the same thing, guys. It had crab claws, yeah, but that's it, and that doesn't count. It's just the same thing. And the ending was just as unsatisfying because it dragged on for so long, and when they eventually did it, it was just, like I've already described it to you, it wasn't satisfying, and there was no conviction in the voices when they were shouting it down, so even the concept that they were going for at the end didn't come across very well. So at the end of the day, you had to at least hand it to Stephen King, that going about stomping a load of spider eggs and like ripping the heart out of a big giant gooey awful spider, just the straight up gore of that is a lot more satisfying than this mess that we got here. The hype really did not live up to the reality in this case with the ending thing. We're finally gonna get onto the conclusion now. Everybody take a deep breath, think about what we've learned today, think about what you think I might be about to say, because I bet I'm not going to say it, because my thoughts are disorganised as hell. During the course of these films, it's really obvious that Muschietti read and understood the source material, and you can tell this through like the references that he makes. For example, there's a lot of turtle imagery. Even though the turtle isn't mentioned, we see that its presence is felt. And, you know, there are little nods to it here and there. Another little detail I liked was that the actress who played Eddie's mum in the first film also plays his wife very briefly in the second film. And, you know, plays into this stereotype of, oh, you married your mother, which is what happens to Eddie in the book. But the fact that you can see that he read it and understood it, and yet we ended up with this fan fiction of the original intense, and not even a very good fanfiction at that. It made the references more frustrating than like exciting. They weren't like an Easter egg. They were like the Easter egg at the ironworks in Derry. Yeah, you know, the one that exploded. A lot of the changes that were made, they were really cliched, and they made the story more familiar and easily digestible for like a Hollywood movie going audience. And even for that audience, I feel like we need to stop spoon feeding our audience stuff, and we need to stop thinking that they're not going to understand something just because it's not something that we've ever really seen before in film. We've seen everything anyway. Like, anyone who's got half a brain cell can understand that Bill's parents have gone cold on him since Georgie died, because we have a scene where his mum's reading a book and he asks her a question like several times before she even realises that he's there. Just one scene. Exactly the same as having that scene where his dad yells at him, creates a completely separate atmosphere in exactly the same amount of time. I'm not saying that the book is perfect. The book had its bad points. I could list several of them. Everybody knows about the child orgy, right? But also there's like Bill cheating on his wife, which kind of plays into the whole midlife crisis deal, but it makes it really hard to root for him as a protagonist when you think about it for a second. And no, he doesn't get a pass just because he ends up having amnesia about it afterwards. I think that the concept that was made up for the film at the end of the day didn't work. So what was the point in changing the source material so much? At the end of the day, an adaptation of this caliber was always going to be about what got cut. But they cut out all the humanity of Pennywise and the bond between the losers that was so important and such an integral part of not only the book, but the first film in this duology. So it was important to these guys as well. So they fucked up there. Alright, this is my favourite part to talk about. It's also the hardest to articulate, so I apologise in advance. When I say that they took out the humanity of Pennywise, what I mean by that is because we didn't focus so much on the themes that made Pennywise relatable to humanity, the only real backstory then that we got of him was where he fell to the sky on a comet. And it makes him completely this alien being that we can't relate ourselves to in any way. I'm about to get really philosophical and deep, guys, okay? I thought I was a genius when I come up with this bit, and it's probably going to come out sounding like a pile of shit, so, you know. When I think about a good horror story, whether it be a book or a film, I think the essential moral is always the same, no matter what. Oh, you can always at least find it in there somewhere, and that is that the real monsters are humans. The worst monsters we can think of are other people, right? Not everyone, but there are some nasty people out there, guys. I know a lot of people say that when they watch a horror film about a ghost, they're not scared, but if they watch a horror film about a person, they are scared because that's something that could really happen. Just goes to show that at the end of the day, the real thing that we should fear is other people. It's by Stephen King especially encapsulates this in the form of the themes, because obviously Pennywise represents all these things that we ignore in society to get on with the normal life because we have that privilege. He's passed down through the generations like any hatred is, like a bad seed. The losers, none of them have kids, despite some of them having tried, because they made the decision to break the generational curse that is Pennywise, right? They didn't have kids because they didn't want to pass down the responsibility of dealing with this entity to their children, even if they weren't in Derry. They knew that they had the responsibility of breaking this generational curse. And when you get into the whole philosophy of that, it's so interesting. And it's like, oh my god, Stephen King was like telling us to look deep within ourselves and at the things that we've inherited from our parents and like break our own generational curses, man. Cocaine's a hell of a drug. This universal moral of horror doesn't really fit with Pennywise, and that really makes him hard to relate to in any capacity. If he is something so alien and unknown to us that we can't see ourselves within him. It even works with the giant spider as well, because at least that's something that we have on Earth. Maybe not, well, maybe in Australia we do have giant ones, but generally not giant ones. But even it having a form that is something tangible, that's something real, a giant spider, as opposed to giant spider crab clown, that's more relatable to us. That's something that we can envision ourselves killing. And that's why the end of this movie doesn't work, because if Pennywise is not relatable to us in any way, if he's this unknowable alien creature, how can we possibly imagine ourselves killing him? And that's literally what the losers have to do in order to defeat it. It works in the first film because they have this childish belief, and the whole struggle in the second part of the book with the adults is how can they possibly recapture that wholehearted belief that you have as a child in magic? Can you even do that? And it was always going to be a question in this second film of whether the producers, the director, whatever, could do that. And unfortunately, I don't think that was the case. Pennywise in It Chapter 2 is not us. He is this weird alien creature who appears to children as their worst fear. His final form is a clown with crab claws. There's no humanity there. Do you understand what I'm saying here? Anyway, yeah, that was the big climactic ending to my big rants. There is one last thing that I want to get into before I close this up though. So we get into the appendix. Are they gay? Okay, so obviously by now we've already talked about the love story between Eddie and Richie a little bit. It's not really explicit in the film. In fact, it's not explicit at all. They obviously have a very close bond when they're kids, and then when they're grown-ups, this bond is rekindled. Richie's really sad when Eddie dies, and then we find out that it was a little more than a close friendship, at least on Richie's part, because he had a crush on Eddie when he was younger. There's no indication either way of whether this crush was reciprocated or whether either of the boys ever acted on it. I don't think they did, but it's not really relevant. The point is, there was a gay romance here. While I was reading the book, I was really looking out for this like homosexual subtext because I never thought about it before. I wanted to look at their friendship from a different perspective in the book to see if there had been any inspiration drawn from that to put into the film, or if it was just this completely random thing. As I was writing this whole script for this video, or whatever you would call it, I realised that my notes about the whole Eddie and Richie situation do not fit into any of my other notes, and they don't even really fit into why I didn't like it chapter 2, because it was the only thing that I did like about it. But I thought it'd be nice to end on a positive note and talk about this one little bit of light in the darkness. So I want to get it out of the way straight away. I have already mentioned it, that Stephen King has stated that he didn't intentionally make any of the losers gay. I've already talked about my feelings about that. But regardless, the book is in the world now and we can interpret it any way we like. And so I would like to say that there is some homosexual subtext between Eddie and Richie. But obviously throughout half the book, they are like 12, and in the other half of the book they are fully grown adults, and Eddie at least has a wife. And he's not like Bill. Eddie doesn't do any cheating. Well, in the book, Eddie is very queer-coded. There is the language that I talked about before, this really simpish language that Eddie uses with Bill, and it's not just like one incident, it's like throughout the book, it's like, oh my god, Eddie loved Bill, he would die for Bill, he would do anything for Bill. If Bill told him to jump off a bridge, he would. Eddie is in love with Bill in the same way that Ben is in love with Beverly. It reads in exactly the same way. Like, when I was reading it for the first few times, like, when you were children, the love that you feel for your friends is really, really deep and strong. And so I just played it off as that. But I also kind of played off Ben's love for Beverly as that as well, because childhood crushes make me cringe. So, also, the leper in the book that accosts Eddie and the leper that it turns into, they're both offering him a blowjob, and obviously Eddie's scared of disease and stuff like that, but it's weird that there's also this, like, edge of sexuality, and also, like, the leper is a guy, so, like, there's this implied subtext that he's, like, afraid of his sexuality. And with all of the themes of homophobia and stuff in the book, it would be perfectly reasonable for me to assume that Eddie is gay, or suspects that he's gay, and is afraid to face that about himself because of the attitudes in his hometown at the time. Also, when the losers come back to Derry, Mike is explaining about all the deaths that have happened up until then that he thinks Pennywise has, like, committed. He says that all of them are personally a call-out, all of them, like, are kind of related to the losers. The guy that they relate to Eddie is Adrian Mellon. Apparently he was asthmatic, but Adrian Mellon is also, and this is a really big focus point of the bit about Adrian Mellon, very gay. So again, there's just this other part of the book that relates homosexuality to Eddie. And it's like, Stephen King, you can say that you didn't intentionally write him that way, but clearly something was going on here, because that's 2 incidences now. As far as Richie goes, He does tease Eddie in a special way in the book, and that's like he always calls him cute, and he always talks about how like adorable he thinks he is, and he like pinches his cheek, and it's like a flirty kind of teasing that he doesn't really do with any of the others. And you could take this in two kind of ways. You could take it as like Richie kind of suspects that Eddie might be questioning, and he is like kind of ragging him a little bit for it. Or you could take it as Richie actually does have a crush on Eddie, and he's doing what he does with the rest of his insecurities and like making humor out of it. They clearly have a special relationship in the book, and that's why it is true that even in the book Richie is the most affected by Eddie's death. It just made me cry in the book. Like, it is horrendous. And like, they go out of the chamber and they have to leave Eddie there, and Richie just kicks the door out of sheer frustration and like shouts at it even though it is dead, and it's really powerful. Obviously you can skew this as they just had that special relationship, they were the closest to each other out of the losers. Richie is obviously upset that his friend that he's just got in touch with again after all those years has died, but you can also interpret it as, you know, Richie and Eddie had latent homosexual feelings for each other and they never got to admit it, and Richie's kind of bitter about that. One other thing that I notice that is a little bit more of a grey area, because I was looking out for this sort of thing, but like I said, I might have missed something. Eddie and Richie are the only ones who the F slur is used in relation to. The scene with Richie is he doesn't want to put his arm, he looks around before he puts his arm around Bill because he doesn't want anyone to think that they're a pair of fagolas, which is something I've never heard before, but not something I'm going to start saying. And then the scene with Eddie is actually when they're grown up and Henry Bowers turns up at the hotel. When Eddie opens the door, Henry greets him with this slur. It's just interesting that although we know that these kids are throwing this slur around like nobody's business, and especially Henry, that's the only time that he uses that slur in relation to any of the losers. I can see why they chose to focus on Richie in the film, because he was the only loser who grew up, went away, and didn't end up having a spouse, and so it would be easy to imply that he wasn't having relationships with women during that time. Ben and Bill are involved in a love triangle, and wouldn't have been conducive to Michael's crazy man persona if he had like a stable relationship where somebody was going, you're acting like a bit of a crazy man, you need to stop eating those peyote cactuses. Both Eddie and Richie have heterosexual relationships in the book, but that isn't evidence either way because we're all perfectly aware by now that bisexuals exist. One thing that I do want to touch on about the film specifically and this theme is that they made Richie's fear clowns, and I obviously said that I had beef with this earlier, but I promise I'm not going to go on about that anymore. This is another reason that I have beef with it. I feel like they literally only changed Richie's fear to clowns so that they could have the joke where one of the kids was afraid specifically of clowns, because that's something that doesn't come up in the book, weirdly. Like, nobody is afraid of clowns, and yet for some reason Pennywise just keeps popping up as one. He just likes it. I don't know. I guess it's ironic because Richie is the clown, and that adds this other layer of humour to it, and it also shows like, oh, he's putting on his makeup because he's gay or something. I don't know. Clowns, you can make them fit into like a gay allegory, but it's not as easy as even the ones that Stephen King picked in the book. Richie's main fear is the teenage werewolf. It's like a puberty allegory mostly, but like you can make it into a homosexuality allegory because like obviously you've got this thing inside you that you think is bad, but you can't control it from coming out because it's part of who you are, right? And his other fear is a giant eyeball, which has apparently got something to do with because he has glasses, but you can interpret it as like he's scared of like other people seeing him and seeing who he really is, which is gay. They definitely could have used a better metaphor than clowns, and I feel like they really did just make him afraid of clowns for the joke, and it wasn't that funny, so what can I say? And that finally brings us to the end of this video. If you're still here, nice one. Literally. Like, because I have been chatting shit for a good while now. I'm gonna go and wash my face, I'm gonna go and make a brew, and I'm not gonna think about this second film again. And if I ever feel like, watching. I will be watching the first one as a standalone. See you later.